This weekend marks the 20th anniversary of the worst terror attack in modern history, when U.S. airliners were hijacked and flown into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, killing almost 3,000 people. Earlier, I spoke with RT's Caleb Maupin, who's following the memorial events in New York City, as well as our senior correspondent, Murad Gazdiev, who is in the Afghan capital of Kabul. Caleb, first to you. It's a solemn day for all Americans, and New York in particular. What's the atmosphere like in the city right now?
Well, it's just gotten dark here, and the lights commemorating the events at the World Trade Center have gone on. There have been people gathering at the site all day, leaving flowers. Firemen, rescue workers, survivors have been gathering. We heard interesting remarks from Kamala Harris, who spoke in Pennsylvania. We also heard from the President of the United States. Former U.S. presidents spoke, elected officials, survivors. Quite an interesting ceremony, all coming amid the decision by the United States to pull out of Afghanistan. Joe Biden's chaotic pullout of Afghanistan seems to be the shadow that is hanging over today's commemorations. Now, when the Vice President Kamala Harris and the President Joe Biden spoke, they called for unity among the American people, a message we've often heard from U.S. elected officials. Here's what they said.
I hope and prayer that we continue to honor their unity by strengthening our common bonds, by strengthening our global partnerships, and by always living out our highest ideals.
We saw national unity bend. We learned that unity is the one thing that must never break. Unity is what makes us who we are, America at its best.
Now, those calls for unity that we heard are pretty standard from U.S. elected officials. However, they were pretty strongly contrasted from the words of former U.S. President George W. Bush. He was president when 9/11 happened. He launched the U.S. invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, and his tone was rather bitter on the 20-year commemoration. Here's George W. Bush.
When it comes to the unity of America, those days seem distant from our own. Malign force seems at work in our common life that turns every disagreement into an argument, and every argument into a clash of cultures. So much of our politics has become a naked appeal to anger, fear, and resentment. That leaves us worried about our nation and our future together.
Quite an interesting tone from the commander-in-chief who started America's longest war and also went down in history for the weapons of mass destruction that turned out to not be there in Iraq. But regardless, the moment in American politics is certainly not one of unity. There is bitter division in the United States. Recently, Joe Biden's decision to pull out of Afghanistan and the chaotic results have his opponents in the Republican Party up in arms. At this point, Republicans are calling for Joe Biden to either resign or be impeached for his actions in Afghanistan. This is what we've heard from Joe Biden's rivals in the Republican Party.
President Biden said that he wanted to take this Afghanistan off the plate for future presidents. He's done the exact opposite. For the next 20 years, American presidents would be dealing with this catastrophe in Afghanistan.
We call upon most somberly the resignation of this President Joe Biden.
Build the case, start doing the work, and figure out how to get this done and impeach Joe Biden.
Joe Biden deserves to be impeached for a high crime and misdemeanor of dereliction of duty.
Now, those sentiments, fearing that Afghanistan could once again become a hotbed for terrorism that could be exported from Afghanistan to the United States, were echoed by the U.S. Secretary of Defense. He echoed these concerns, saying that now that's the focus of the USA, making sure Afghanistan doesn't once again become a base for terrorism. And we now look at the chaotic pullout of Afghanistan, where the Taliban, who were once declared terrorists by the United States, are now once again in power, as well as terrorist groups like ISIS-K have set up shop. You have a lot of Americans, 20 years later, looking at the war on terror and saying, what was it all for? What did it accomplish? What was the purpose of it? It's been 20 years since 9/11. A lot of survivors have a lot of questions, not a lot of closure, and not a lot of clarity here in New York City.
Let's go now to you, Morad. The 9/11 attacks set in motion, of course, a tragic chapter in Afghan history. Can you tell us about the consequences that America's war on terror has had on the Afghan people?
Well, they're being felt all over the city, all over Afghanistan. As we speak, thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people are now going hungry because foreign aid was cut off almost entirely once United States troops, the last of them, left Kabul airport. The Taliban has been celebrating, as have their supporters, again, all over the country. We saw fireworks today on the 20th anniversary of 9/11 all over the city, not quite as intense as what we saw when American troops pulled out, but nevertheless, there you have it. The Taliban has been busy solidifying its rule here in Afghanistan, its authority, which at this point is almost undisputed. More than that, we have seen from the new government that they have announced that there is no compromise. They don't feel like they have to compromise to anyone, given how quickly, how rapidly they took over the entire country, how quickly they reportedly crushed much of the resistance to them in Panjshir Valley. We know that the Taliban wants desperately now international recognition. It wants access to all the funds that have been frozen. It wants humanitarian aid to resume, because over these long years, the United States and its allies, they got Afghanistan almost addicted to foreign aid. Many people here desperately require it to live, to get by, and that aid has been cut off for now. It is no exaggeration when I say thousands, tens of thousands just in Kabul, where we are now, in the streets with their families, begging for work, begging for food. So things are certainly very desperate here, with much of the country demolished, both politically, financially, and socially, as a result of the U.S. occupation here. An occupation that, as I reported earlier, is very difficult to call successful. In 2001, it began with righteousness and pomp. Invade Afghanistan to fight for freedom, to fight terrorism and make the world a better place. 19 years, 10 months and 25 days on, this is America's legacy. Destroyed and sabotaged equipment, a country brought to ruin and still in control of the Taliban. That is the ultimate tragedy of the Afghan war. It was entirely and violently pointless. Years and years of an obliging, little questioning media fooled billions into believing that there was progress, that America could win.
Total victory over the Taliban.
The Taliban fled.
The end of the Taliban.
Taliban leadership on the run.
And now the question is, how do you handle that success?
It wasn't supposed to be this way. The Taliban wasn't supposed to sweep the country in mere weeks. The Pentagon spent a decade preparing to leave Afghanistan, and even they weren't ready for this.
Together with our allies, we will complete our mission there by the end of this year.
I announced a timeline for drawing down our forces.
We are working to finally end America's longest war.
And it's time to end the forever war.
America's proudest moment of the Afghan war wasn't supposed to be a humiliating evacuation under the guns of the Taliban, but it was. There is absolutely nothing else to celebrate.
The United States ended 20 years of war in Afghanistan, the longest war in American history. We completed one of the biggest airlifts in history, with more than 120,000 people evacuated to safety. No nation, No nation has ever done anything like it in all of history. Only the United States had the capacity and the will and ability to do it, and we did it today.
Where was the Afghan army? Where was the Western-backed government? Where did all the money go? The United States sunk more than $100 billion into rebuilding Afghanistan. For reference, adjusted for inflation, that is more than the United States spent on the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe after World War II. And the tragedy of it is that for a civilian, aside from all the American weapons in the Taliban's hands, there is almost no evidence that any of that money ever passed through here. From broken roads that lead to nowhere to abandoned hospitals, from twisted contractors and corrupt leaders, Afghanistan can arguably be called the largest money laundering operation in human history.
The United States is also committed to playing a leading role in the reconstruction of Afghanistan.
The Taliban now has more Black Hawk helicopters than 85% of the countries in the world. Al-Qaeda and ISIS-K still exist and are growing in Afghanistan, and eventually they acquire these weapons.
We now have Americans stuck in Afghanistan, the Taliban in charge, with more weaponry than they've ever had in the past, and a border that is open.
The Taliban now controls more of the country than it did before the US invaded. Its new government is filled with Guantanamo Bay inmates and terrorist mujahideen, who even have American bounties on their heads. What Washington achieved was the absolute opposite of what it intended. The bombing at Kabul airport during the evacuation epitomized the Afghan war, a senseless act devoid of reason which needlessly cut short so many lives.
We will not forgive. We will not forget. We will hunt you down and make you pay.
We've heard the same promise before. 20 years ago, when America was united and when it thought that it could change the world, when it thought it was invincible, and when the people believed a president's promise. Morad Ghazdiev, RT, Kabul, Afghanistan.